Our final morning keynote is an award-winning researcher who focuses on sustainable business as it relates to social activism, firm strategy, and entrepreneurship. Please join me in welcoming Desirée Pacheco from Portland State University.
Hi, everyone. I am not a punk rocker. I might be able to entertain you with some salsa steps, but I'm not sure that you would want that. But if there's enough applauses, I might get there. Thank you for having the opportunity to be here. I'm a professor at Portland State, and I'm going to be giving you a bit of a review on some research that I'm working with my colleague Jason Green and Tom Dean. And today, what I want to do is talk about how companies can think bigger when it comes to making an impact, but also how companies can think beyond their own organizations, beyond their immediate environment, into the broader environment, into the bigger systems, right? And I want to leave you today with two things. Number one, why that matters, but I think Jonathan did a very good job at that, so I'm going to summarize that quickly. And number two, give you a framework for what role companies can play in working with these larger systems towards change. And in doing that, very often what it means is that we need to change our incremental mindsets towards more transformational change. And Jonathan talked about climate change. I want to put it into perspective too in terms of media coverage and what it means to have large issues that require imminent action like climate change. This is a number of newspaper articles throughout the world that covered the topic climate change and the keywords urgency or emergency in the same article. Obviously, quite the spike in the last years. And with that, not surprisingly, headlines such as "It's time to panic over climate change," or "We have somewhere around 12 years to avert a catastrophe" on climate change and what it means to the world, but also to humanity. And climate change is not alone, right? Obviously, there are other issues that are related, from deforestation to species preservation or the lack of it, and other social issues like poverty, human rights, and the unprecedented number of refugees that we're facing, right? The UN has called for business to shift from an incremental mindset towards more breakthrough innovation in its sustainable development goals for this reason. So we have been called to this action more recently, understanding the need for this type of transformational change. And what this means is that we need to start thinking more in terms of systems, right? And when I talk about systems, without giving the academic sort of spiel here, we're talking about looking more downstream, perhaps, more upstream into your company, looking at your competitors, looking at your industry, and how you can influence your industry as a whole to do better. Perhaps changing energy systems, changing the transportation system, coming up with new business models that might transform those systems, like what Beeline is doing in terms of that innovation. And then how do we bring those innovations to scale so that we can actually make that change? And companies are recognizing the need for system-level change. This is just one example over here. Unilever states that change in their own business is not enough, right? Incremental improvements beyond our business are not enough. We need fundamental change to whole systems if we are to make a genuine difference. Right? Very often, when we say, well, what role do businesses play in changing systems? Well, we start looking at the system and we look for those opportunities for improvement, right? Where are the holes? Where are the big issues? And we're innovators, right? We're the industry. We're here to innovate. Let's come up with a new product, a new service, a new business model that is going to transform the system. And to really change that system, we need to be thinking about how it's going to be diffused. How do we take that sustainable innovation and diffuse it, bring it to scale so that we see the outcomes later on and start to see that transformational change. But how many times can you think of innovations that you thought were going to do that? Oh, we innovated, we created this, we did that, we did the other thing. Let's put solar power just quickly into perspective. And a technology that has become much more efficient, more cost competitive as well, and yet when we look at the adoption rates of solar energy, far from its potential, right? In this country at least. And so what is precluding these technologies to take off? Why can't they get traction? And that's a really important question. And very often the answer is the system, man, right? And very important with this, the system, is the set of system stakeholders that operate in it. And I'm gonna tell you about two types of stakeholders. Number one is what I call the diffuse stakeholders. These are multiple and many stakeholders, which as I'm calling them diffused. On their own, they cannot make a big dent, but collectively they can. And these stakeholders are your end users, your consumers, right? That market, but also the communities in which those markets are, as well as, in general, the communities that support your business and your operations. And so those are those diffuse stakeholders. For any innovation to change a system, at the very least, companies need to gain the endorsement and support from those diffuse stakeholders, at the very least, right? Without a market, we can't diffuse an innovation. But there's also a set of more centralized stakeholders. These are stakeholders that are larger, that individually, on their own, can make a bigger dent. Right? These are stakeholders like government, competitors, suppliers, and corporate buyers that hold control very often of the technology and the infrastructure of a system and in an industry, for example. And there's some very important differences between these two categories of stakeholders. Relationships with centralized stakeholders tend to be more formal in nature, right? They tend to be more about economic power and contracts. Relationships with your diffuse stakeholders, on the other hand, can be more informal in nature. They rely more on trust and social desirability. And that is important for what I'm about to say. So bear with me. I know this looks maybe a little bit more complicated, but it is less so. So hopefully I'll graduate from explaining it. And so with that in mind, that idea that, hey, this is really important, we need to think about how do you influence system stakeholders, we got busy. And we went out there and we interviewed companies that we thought were transformational and that were working in changing their systems. In fact, there's quite a few of you here who were part of those interviews, and I want to thank you for being part of this research. We also did a systematic review of cases and research in this area to understand how can companies go out there and influence stakeholders. And what became very evident to start with is the fact that the amount of power that companies have over these types of stakeholders, it matters significantly for their ability to change systems. And so with that in mind, I want to talk to you about 3 different types of power. The first one is referent power. Referent power is the type of power that you gain as an individual or as an organization from admiration or respect. It's the type of power that Lady Gaga has over her fans. It comes from admiration or respect. But it also, very often, comes from authenticity. It comes from being able to be perceived as genuine, as true to yourself, as true to your values. And when you're perceived that way, those who also espouse your values respect you more. Then we have legitimate power. This is the type of power that an organization or an individual gains simply because it has the right or the license to influence others. This is the type of power that a supervisor has over their employees. Okay? So you have the right and you're legitimate enough to influence others. And finally, there's coercive power, right? This is the type of power that an individual or an organization has because they can influence others or others, I should say, based on either direct or indirect threats. And what research shows us over and over is that the size and the amount of resources that organizations have impact their ability to have these types of power. So they go hand in hand. So knowing the importance of, number one, authenticity for referent power, and number two, of size for referent and coercive power, we came up with this framework over here. And so you can see on the axis over there, perceived authenticity versus size. And so we created these categories of companies using the analogy of animals in an ecosystem and their role in transforming a system. So let me take you a little bit through these categories, right? On the upper right-hand side here, you could see legitimate lions. Legitimate lions are the types of companies, this is the ideal change maker and transform, and sort of has the highest transformational power, I should say. These are companies like Patagonia, Tesla, Unilever, that enjoy authenticity and scale, and therefore all of those different types of power to make changes in a system. Down here we have the resourceful guerrillas. These are the larger companies that, again, enjoy the scale, but don't have as much authenticity when it comes to their sustainability practices per se. Companies like perhaps Nike, Toyota, Walmart, that would fit in that category. Over on the upper left side, we have the genuine Bs. And so these are companies that have authenticity, but don't have the scale. A lot of B Corps fit in this category. And I, in fact, have put examples of some of you who are either here today or that I've known and worked with this research on. And then finally, we have the dependent Joeys. This is like Joey kangaroos. They depend on others to bring change because they lack authenticity and the scale to get to that level of change. So with this in mind, what I want to do is tell you that these categories matter. And they matter because depending on what quadrant you are, so to speak, they're a little fluid, not fully rigid, but depending on what quadrant you are as a company, you are going to have different strategies that are going to be more successful to be able to change the system. And so that's what I want to talk about right now. The main premise of this is that if you are a larger company and you have legitimate and coercive power, you're going to be better able at targeting centralized stakeholders directly and unilaterally on your own. Obviously, collaboration is always welcome, but if you are a company that has that scale, you can go after those centralized stakeholders in a more successful way. But on the other hand, if you enjoy authenticity and the referent power that it brings, you can be also very successful at targeting those diffuse stakeholders. So I'm going to be talking about how companies do that in those different profiles. And what really is important here is the fact that authenticity matters for diffuse stakeholders because, like I mentioned before, trust and social desirability are really important when we address those stakeholders. So let's talk about legitimate lions. Over there, we said over on the graph, higher in size, higher in authenticity, enjoy all types of powers. So these are companies that can target diffused stakeholders unilaterally. They can go out there and talk to consumers and the public at large, and because of their scale, they can have high reach and impact. And they can do this through activism. They can also do this through cost recruitment, right? This is what Patagonia does with Patagonia Action Works. Putting out a platform out there to allow people to understand what opportunities they have to volunteer for environmental initiatives. They also can do this through educating the media, educating the public, through the media, through op-eds, documentary, books, etc. And these companies also have the coercive power and legitimate to be able to target those centralized stakeholders. They can influence competitors, impose supplier standards, and lobby government. Companies like Unilever, for example, work on and participate in the UN climate summits as well as advocates directly for keeping carbon emissions at levels agreed upon in Paris. Resourceful guerrillas are companies that higher in size but lower in that authenticity, like I mentioned. So they do enjoy and have that coercive and legitimate power, which allows them to target centralized stakeholders on their own and directly. These companies can influence competitors, engage in direct lobbying, as well as they're able to impose supplier standards. We can think of Walmart as a good example here. I mean, Walmart, with its sustainability index right now, about 70% of its suppliers participate in that. And while we can be cynical about how Walmart, in general, about how these initiatives are a bit watered down, my main point is that Walmart does have the power to create initiatives like this. And in a recent survey, companies noted that Walmart was the #1 retailer that influenced their sustainability practices. Resourceful guerrillas, on the other hand, lack the referent power and their authenticity. So for them to target diffused stakeholders like consumers and the public, they need to do this through partnerships with more authentic organizations or companies. Nestle, for example, when it goes out there into communities to come up with ways in which to have more responsible water management and practices, it does that through local and international NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, right? But it's really hard for Nestle to do this on their own because they lack that authenticity. And then finally, the genuine bees. Obviously, as compared to those guerrillas, have lower coercive power, and perhaps in some ways also some lower legitimate power. And because of that, for these companies to target centralized stakeholders, they often need to do that through collaboration. Right? And that means engaging in collective lobbying, engaging in partnerships with NGOs, with industry members or competitors. But one other thing that we came through in our research is the fact that sometimes it's so hard for companies of smaller scale to target those centralized stakeholders that they choose to bypass them altogether. And so how do you bypass the centralized stakeholders? Well, you could innovate by coming up with these very creative business models in ways that you just make your competition irrelevant. Or you could vertically integrate in your supply chain so that you have full control of your supply chain and not have to deal with those powerful suppliers or corporate buyers. However, to really get to the scale of system change that we're looking for, you still need to go to those diffuse stakeholders, right? Because you still need the scale. And so how do we get to those diffuse stakeholders? A lot of these companies engage in activism, in cost recruitment. Companies like Tony's Chocolonely, I know they're somewhere around here, have their program Serious Friends, where customers and the public at large can sign up to learn more about opportunities to understand how to contribute to the cocoa industry, make conditions in that industry more fair. These companies also educate those diffuse stakeholders through the media, different forms, right? We've talked about some of those. But also there's another type of strategy that I think is more unique to the genuine bees because it works really well with smaller companies, which is artivism or craftivism. Right? It's this idea of using art and craftsmanship as a medium to push your social or your environmental agenda. And I've seen this in one of my other studies on sustainable apparel specifically and looking at how companies do that and leverage their art. And so I'm going to leave you with a few messages here. We started from the premise, and this is not just perhaps my talk, maybe I could take the liberty of saying from some of the other talks today, that we need to think bigger. We need to start thinking in terms of transformational change. And that requires that we think about systems and how might we influence them. For this research, I interviewed both one of the founders of B Corp as well as some of the leadership in B Corp Europe. And they all agree that this is the next frontier for the B Corp movement. This is our next step. It's going beyond being good corporate citizenship, right? It's about going beyond that and thinking more in terms of systems and how we influence them. Now, many of you and many B Corps fit that genuine B category. And these companies have authenticity but don't have the scale and therefore the coercive power to bring change. So I leave you with these questions today. How can your company address its limited coercive power to bring change? What kinds of partnerships and collaborations can you think of that are going to allow you to compensate for that lack of power? But at the same time, how can your company leverage its authenticity and the referent power that you have to bring system change? How can you engage in activism? How can you create movements? How can you participate in movements that are going to help us to build the momentum that we need to make those longer leaps and those stronger shifts that our society needs? Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.